Good morning, into environmental and science students. Well, probably afternoon or evening, actually, when you are doing this prep work. So today we're going to be discussing the phosphorus cycle. So you're going to see some slides. I'm going to talk about them in your student handout. Please make sure you are taking notes so that you have this information to dive into our activity when you return to class next. So first of all, what is the phosphorus cycle? Just like any cycle, this is the movement of phosphorus around the biosphere and the geosphere. Cycle meaning that it starts in one place and eventually will make its way back to the same place. Of course, the phosphorus cycle, those molecules of phosphorus can take a lot of different paths as they move between the biosphere and the geosphere. So let's first just start by talking about what is phosphorus and why is it so important to living things. Phosphorus is one of the main components in our DNA, our RNA, and the molecule ATP, which you hopefully remember is what we use for energy. Of course, all of these things, our DNA, RNA, and ATP, are essential for life. Therefore, phosphorus is an essential nutrient for life, and the amount of phosphorus in an ecosystem is one of the things that determines how many organisms can be supported. So it moves around through both biotic processes, meaning processes that happen in living things, and abiotic processes, processes that happen outside of living things. The biotic processes are pretty simple. It's assimilation and mineralization. Organisms, particularly plants, absorb phosphorus through their roots, and that phosphorus then gets transferred to other living things. So when you eat, you are getting the phosphorus and those nutrients that are coming from organisms that you eat. Similarly, when organisms die, that phosphorus can be returned into the soil, recycled when it's broken down by bacteria through decomposition, and those phosphorus molecules can then re-enter other organisms in the soil. So we want phosphorus-rich soil for things to grow. That concept becomes important later when we think about how humans have been involved in the phosphorus cycle. The abiotic processes include sedimentation, geologic uplift, and weathering. In water, phosphorus is not very soluble, so much of it precipitates out of the solution in the form of phosphorus-laden sediments in the ocean, meaning phosphorus is not just floating around throughout the ocean, it tends to settle to the bottom in sediment. You'll see this in a figure later. Over time, geological forces can lift these ocean layers up and they become mountains. The phosphate rocks in the mountains are slowly weathered by natural forces, bringing that phosphorus into terrestrial as well as aquatic habitats. So here you see some mountain ranges that are high in phosphorus. Weathering, such as erosion, has brought sediment, small phosphorus molecules, back into the dirt and the soil that is surrounding this area. Now, because phosphorus isn't very water soluble, very little of it ends up in water bodies, which means that typically water and aquatic habitats, aquatic biomes, are pretty low in dissolved phosphorus that might be needed for aquatic photosynthetic organisms. And so it is a limiting nutrient in many aquatic ecosystems. Okay, so like always, humans have done something to disrupt this process that's been going on for millennia. The main thing that has happened is that we realized, like I said, that phosphorus is really important for plant growth. So we started mining phosphorus from these mountains and putting it into our fertilizers. We put the fertilizer on the soil, but what ends up happening is the fertilizer in the soil begins to move into waterways. So that can happen through a couple different things. One is called leaching. This is where it seeps as water falls. The phosphorus moves down through the soil into the groundwater, which is a layer of water that sits below the soil layer on Earth. That groundwater tends to end up flowing into lakes and other bodies of water eventually. The other is surface runoff. This you see depicted in the picture where water runs along the surface. You see this happen all the time on NYC streets when the water is flowing across the surface. it carries with it some of that phosphate that ends up in the river. Okay, what does it matter? Well, we said that waterways tend to be very low in phosphorus, meaning that there is not an extreme amount of algae that can be supported in those ecosystems because there's not enough phosphorus. When phosphorus runs into these waterways, then the algae can do what we call bloom, meaning these single-celled organisms that are photosynthetic reproduce really quickly, and you see these bright green algae blooms. Now, great, so there's more producers. However, they die very quickly. These single-celled organisms don't live for very long. When they do die off, their decomposition uses a lot of oxygen. So any oxygen that they're putting into the water actually ends up getting used back up by their own decomposition. And it can go so far as to create what we call a hypoxic zone or hypoxic condition, where there's just not enough oxygen left in the waterway for other organisms to survive, and we end up with a dead zone. So we humans, through the leaching and runoff of phosphorus into waterways, are creating particular waterways and aquatic ecosystems where life cannot flourish. So let's take a look at the whole of this cycle, right? So again, you notice where plants can take the phosphorus in, that those plants are then going to be eaten by these organisms. When those organisms die, the phosphorus returns into the soil. The key component here, right, is the extraction of phosphorus by humans, and that is used in fertilizer that runs off into rivers and streams, ending up in large bodies of water and disrupting those marine ecosystems. You also see the marine sedimentation, so this phosphorus layer that tends to be at the bottom, that's what gets pushed back up to eventually create these mountain ranges that you see. Another important source of phosphorus, it has become more outlawed, but phosphorus used to be a really key component of detergent. So when people use detergent to wash their clothes, phosphorus ended up in the wash in the water that then got drained out and back into waterways. Many countries, including the US, have banned the use of phosphorus in detergents. However, globally, that is not true. And so phosphorus runoff and phosphorus leaching is affecting some parts of the world more than others. So that is the basics of the phosphorus cycle and how it moves around and why it is important for living things.